3 days after his parents received the telegram saying he was dead. His final letter still arrived. Inside were 43 seconds that changed the world forever. The humid air of Tinian Island hung like a shroud over the airfield that night of August 5, 1945. In the darkness before dawn, the massive silhouettes of B-29 superfortresses lined the coral runway, their aluminum skin gleaming faintly under the stars. Among them sat a bomber that would soon carry a name the world would never forget. Though on this night, it was just another aircraft being prepared for what everyone knew was no ordinary mission. Inside the Quonset huts that served as quarters for the 509th Composite Group, men lay awake despite the exhaustion that pulled at their bones. They had been training for months, flying practice runs with dummy bombs, maintaining an almost unbearable level of secrecy that isolated them even from other units on the base. Now, in these final hours, the weight of what was to come pressed down like the tropical heat that never quite lifted, even in the depths of night. Captain James Mitchell, a composite character created for this narrative, sat on the edge of his cot, a sheet of paper spread on a makeshift desk fashioned from an ammunition crate. The pen in his hand trembled slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the magnitude of trying to capture in words what might be his final thoughts. Outside, he could hear the distant clang of metal on metal as ground crews worked through the night, preparing the aircraft for its historic flight. The sound carried across the still air, punctuating the tropical night with its mechanical rhythm. "Dearest Martha," he began, then crossed it out. How could he begin a letter that might be his last? How could he explain what he barely understood himself? They had been told only fragments, that they carried a special bomb, that it had the power of thousands of regular bombs, that it might end the war. But the scientists who had briefed them, those thin, nervous men who had arrived from New Mexico with their slide rules and classified documents, their eyes had held something else. Fear? Awe? Mitchell couldn't tell, but it had unsettled him more than any combat mission over Tokyo. He started again. "My darling, by the time you read this, the world will have changed. We all sense it here, though none of us can quite grasp what that change will mean. I'm writing this in the hours before what they're calling the most important mission of the war, perhaps of all time. The colonel says we're going to save lives, hundreds of thousands of American boys who won't have to invade Japan. But Martha, I can't shake the feeling that we're about to cross a line from which there's no return." The pen scratched across the paper, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet barracks. Around him, other men pretended to sleep, but Mitchell could tell from their breathing that they too were awake, each lost in their own thoughts. Some wrote letters of their own. Others simply stared at the curved ceiling of the Quonset hut, perhaps praying, perhaps trying not to think at all. "They've trained us for months," the letter continued. "Special missions, they called them, flying out over the Pacific and dropping single bombs, huge things that weighed as much as 5 regular bombs. We'd drop them and bank hard, putting as much distance between us and the target as possible. They never told us why we needed to get so far away from our own bomb. Now I think I understand. The physicists, that's what those nervous men from the desert are. They let slip some things. They talk about atoms, about splitting matter itself. One of them, after too much whiskey at the officers' club, said we were unleashing the power of the sun. The sun? Martha. What have we done?" The narrative must pause here to provide context that Mitchell could not have known, context that only became clear in the years that followed. Mitchell's letter continued, "I've been thinking about home a lot lately, about that little house we're going to buy when this is all over, the one with the porch facing west so we can watch the sunsets. I think about Sunday dinners and the sound of children playing in the yard, the children will have when I come home. But tonight, I'm not sure what kind of world I'll be coming home to, or if I'll come home at all." The preparation for the mission had been meticulous. Colonel Paul Tibbets, commanding officer of the 509th, had handpicked his crew. They were the best of the best, men who had flown dozens of missions over Japan, who could handle a B-29 in their sleep. But this mission was different. The security was unlike anything they had experienced. Armed guards surrounded the aircraft. The bomb itself was under constant watch. Even the crew members were shadowed by security personnel who reported on their every conversation. every letter home. They've told us that refusing orders in wartime, especially orders of this magnitude, would be considered treason. Mitchell wrote, his handwriting becoming more cramped as he tried to fit everything onto the page. They didn't need to say what the penalty for treason would be. We all know. But Martha, even if I wanted to refuse, and God help me, part of me does, what would that accomplish? Another man would take my place. The bomb would still fall. The only difference would be that our children would grow up without a father, and with the shame of his cowardice. The letter went on. I've killed before. We all have. That's what we do up there at 25,000 feet, dropping our loads on targets that look like model train sets from that height. But we knew we were hitting factories, rail yards, military targets. There were civilians, yes, but that was incidental. This is different. The target is a city. A whole city. The briefing officer showed us the aerial photographs. I could see the streets, the bridges, the buildings that must be homes, schools, hospitals. They tell us it's a military target, that it's a major army depot, but Martha, I saw those photographs. It's a city where people live, where children play, where life goes on just as it does in San Francisco or Chicago. At 2:45 a.m., the crews would begin final preparations. The Enola Gay, named after Colonel Tibbetts' mother, would take off at 2:45 a.m., accompanied by 2 observation planes, the Great Artiste and Necessary Evil. They would fly for 6 hours to reach their target. 6 hours for the crew to think about what they were about to do. 6 hours for doubt to creep in, for fear to take hold, for conscience to war with duty. I can hear the engines starting up now. Mitchell continued his letter, though in reality, there were still hours to go. But in his imagination, he could already hear them, those massive Wright R-3350 engines that would carry them across the Pacific. That low rumble that gets into your bones. How many times have I heard that sound? 100? More? But tonight it sounds different. Tonight it sounds like the drums of Judgment Day. They say this bomb might end the war, the letter continued. That the Japanese will have to surrender when they see what we can do. If that's true, if this one terrible act saves hundreds of thousands of lives, then perhaps it's justified. Perhaps. But Martha, I keep thinking about the people below that bomb when it falls. They won't know what hit them, the scientists say. It will be instantaneous. But what about those at the edges? What about those who survive the initial blast? What hell are we about to create? As Mitchell continued to write, the base around him was coming to life despite the early hour. Mechanics ran final checks on the aircraft. The weaponeers made their final inspections of the bomb, checking the fusing mechanisms, the radar altimeters that would trigger the detonation at precisely the right altitude. In the mess hall, cooks prepared what might be the last meal for some of these men, though statistically, this mission would be safer than many of the conventional bombing runs over Japan, where anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks had claimed so many B-29s. I need you to know, Mitchell wrote, that whatever happens, whatever history says about what we're about to do, I love you. I love the life we've planned together. I love the future we've imagined. If I don't come back, know that my last thoughts were of you, of home, of all the simple, beautiful things that make life worth living and that make war such a terrible necessity. And if I do come back, I fear I'll be changed. How can a man participate in something like this and remain the same? How can I look at our future children and not think of the children who won't have futures because of what I'm about to do? The letter was becoming a confession, a pouring out of fears and doubts that military discipline would never allow him to express aloud. This was the paradox of military service in a democracy, citizens trained to be soldiers, taught to follow orders without question, yet retaining the conscience and moral framework of the civilization they were defending. The atomic bomb pushed this paradox to its absolute limit. The chaplain came by earlier. The letter went on. He offered to pray with anyone who wanted it. Most of the guys took him up on it, even the ones who haven't seen the inside of a church since boot camp. He read from the Bible something about beating swords into plowshares. It seemed almost like a cruel joke. Here we are, about to unleash a weapon that makes every sword, every gun, every conventional bomb seem like a child's toy, and he's talking about peace. But maybe that's the point. Maybe this terrible thing we're about to do will make war itself obsolete. Maybe when the world sees what warfare has become, they'll refuse to wage it ever again. I should tell you about the men I'm flying with, Mitchell wrote, trying to shift to something more concrete, more normal. There's Tommy from Detroit, the bombardier. He's got a girl back home too. Shows her picture to anyone who'll look. Says they're going to get married the moment he gets back. There's Eddie, our navigator, who can find his way across the Pacific like he's driving to the corner store. He's got that gift, you know? Never gets lost, always knows exactly where we are even when everything looks the same for miles and miles. And our pilot, well, he's the steadiest man I've ever known. Never seen him rattled. Not even when we lost 2 engines over Osaka and had to limp back on the other 2. The sun will be up soon, Mitchell continued. I can see the first hints of light on the eastern horizon. In a few hours, we'll be over Japan. The weather report says it will be clear, perfect visibility. That's good for the mission, they say. We need to see the target clearly. But I almost wish for clouds, for fog, for anything that might delay this moment. Is that cowardice? Or is it the last protest of whatever humanity I have left? Part 2. The narrative now shifts to the pre-dawn hours of August 6th. The fictional Mitchell seals his letter, knowing he may never have the chance to send it. Around him, the barracks are stirring. Men are pulling on their flight suits, checking their gear, going through the routines that have become second nature. But there's a tension in the air, an electricity that everyone can feel but no one acknowledges directly. In the briefing room, Colonel Tibbets addresses the crew one final time. The real Tibbets was, by all accounts, a man of remarkable composure, chosen specifically for his ability to handle pressure. In our narrative, he speaks with that same steady confidence. Gentlemen, you've trained for this moment. You know your jobs. Do them well and we'll all come home. The eyes of history are upon us, though the world doesn't know it yet. Let's make sure we give them something worth remembering. Mitchell takes his position in the aircraft. The B-29 was a marvel of engineering, the most advanced bomber of its time. But on this morning, it feels like a tomb, a metal coffin carrying them toward an appointment with destiny. The familiar smell of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid fills his nostrils. The seat, worn to the shape of his body from countless missions, feels different somehow, as if it belongs to someone else. Starting engines. The pilot announces over the intercom. One by one, the 4 massive engines roar to life, their sound building until it drowns out everything else. This is the point of no return. Once they're airborne, there's no turning back. The mission will proceed regardless of any individual's doubts or fears. Mitchell pulls out the letter one more time, adding a postscript. We're about to take off. I can feel the aircraft vibrating, straining against the brakes, eager to leap into the sky. Or maybe it's reluctant, sensing what it carries in its belly. They've painted a name on the nose, Enola Gay, someone's mother. I wonder what she would think if she knew what her name would be associated with. I wonder what my mother would think if she knew what her son was about to do. The taxi to the runway seems to take forever. Through the window, Mitchell can see other aircraft preparing for takeoff, the weather planes that will scout ahead, the observation planes that will document the bombing. Cleared for takeoff, comes the voice from the tower. The engines rise to a crescendo, and the heavily loaded bomber begins to roll. Slowly at first, then faster, faster, until finally the wheels leave the ground and they're airborne. Below them, Tinian falls away, becoming just another speck in the vast Pacific. Ahead lies 6 hours of flight time, 6 hours to think, to doubt, to pray, to prepare for what cannot truly be prepared for. We're climbing now, Mitchell writes hastily, knowing he needs to finish the letter soon. The island is already disappearing behind us. In a few hours, we'll be over Japan. I keep thinking about the people there, waking up to what they think is just another day. They have no idea what's coming. Neither do we, really. We know the bomb will explode, but what then? What kind of world will exist on the other side of that explosion? The flight across the Pacific is smooth, almost unnaturally so. The weather is perfect, not a cloud in the sky. The drone of the engines becomes hypnotic, a constant thrumming that seems to sync with the heartbeat. Some of the crew try to maintain normalcy, chatting about baseball scores, about plans for after the war. But the conversations feel forced, hollow. Everyone knows this isn't a normal mission. As they approach Japan, the tension ratchets up again. They'll be entering enemy airspace, though intelligence suggests that Japanese fighter coverage is minimal at this point in the war. The Japanese Air Force has been largely destroyed, their best pilots dead, their fuel reserves almost exhausted. Still, there's always the possibility of anti-aircraft fire, of that one lucky shot that could end everything. We can see the Japanese coast now. Mitchell continues his letter, writing in small, cramped script to fit everything on the remaining paper. It's beautiful from up here. Green mountains, blue sea, everything sparkling in the morning sun. It's hard to believe we're at war with the people down there. From this height, you can't see the differences between us. You can't see the hatred, the fear, the propaganda that's turned us into enemies. You just see the land, indifferent to human conflict. The approach to Hiroshima is almost anticlimactic. No fighters rise to meet them. No flak bursts around them. The city lies spread out below, peaceful in the morning light. People are going to work, children are going to school. Life is proceeding as it has for centuries in this ancient city. They have less than an hour left of that life, that world. The bombardier is making his final calculations now, Mitchell writes. I can see the city below. It's bigger than I expected, sprawling along the river delta. I can see the bridges, 7 of them, spanning the branches of the river. The briefing officer called it the target, but from here I can see it's a city, a real place where real people live. In a few minutes, many of those people will cease to exist. They'll simply vanish, turned to vapor by the heat of our artificial sun. At 8:09 a.m., the bomb bay doors open. The aircraft lurches slightly as the 5-ton bomb falls away. The pilot immediately banks hard, putting as much distance as possible between them and the detonation point. They have 43 seconds. It's away, Mitchell scribbles. The bomb is falling. 43 seconds until it detonates. 43 seconds left of the old world. I'm counting them down in my head. 42, 41, 40. Each second feels like an hour. 39, 38. Below us, people are still going about their morning routines. 37, 36. Children are sitting in classrooms. 35, 34. Mothers are preparing breakfast. 33, 32. Old men are reading newspapers. 31, 30. 2019-18. Mitchell's letter continues, the handwriting now almost illegible in his haste. God forgive us. 17, 16, 15. What have we done? 14, 13, 12. Martha, I love you. 11, 10, 9. Remember me not for this. 8, 7, 6. Remember me for who I was before. 5, 4, 3. Remember me alive. 2, 1. The flash comes first, a light brighter than the sun, brighter than anything human eyes were meant to see. Even with their protective goggles, even turned away from the blast, the crew sees the bones in their hands, sees the shadows of their own skeletons. Then comes the shock wave, hitting the aircraft like a giant's fist, tossing the massive bomber like a toy. The tail gunner, looking back, sees something rising from where the city used to be. A column of smoke and fire climbing toward the stratosphere, spreading at the top like some monstrous mushroom. My God! Someone says over the intercom. My God, what have we done? Mitchell doesn't write anymore. There are no words for what he's seeing. The city of Hiroshima has ceased to exist as a recognizable entity. In its place is a roiling cauldron of fire and smoke, a wound in the earth itself. The mushroom cloud continues to rise, 30,000, 40,000 feet, its top spreading out in the stratosphere like the canopy of hell. The journey back to Tinian is made in almost complete silence. The initial elation that some feel, the mission was successful, the bomb worked, quickly gives way to a deeper realization of what they've just participated in. They've crossed a threshold from which there can be no return. They've introduced into human conflict a weapon that threatens the very survival of the species. Hours later, when they land back at Tinian, they're greeted as heroes. There are photographers, reporters, commanding officers congratulating them on a job well done. But Mitchell, our fictional airman, feels hollow. He looks at the letter in his pocket, still unsent, and wonders if he'll ever be able to explain what happened, what it felt like to be the agent of such destruction. But for Mitchell and the men like him, both the fictional ones and the real airmen who flew these missions, the debate was academic. They had done their duty. They had followed orders. They had been the instruments of a new age, an atomic age that would define the rest of the 20th century and beyond. Mitchell's letter ends with a postscript, added after landing, "I'm alive. We're back on Tinian. The world still exists, though it's not the same world we left this morning. I don't know if I'll send this letter. How can I burden you with this knowledge? How can I explain what we've done? They're calling us heroes. They say we've ended the war, saved countless lives. Maybe we have. But Martha," I looked back at that cloud, at that pillar of fire rising into the sky, and all I could think was that we've opened a door that should have remained closed. We've taken unto ourselves a power that belongs to the gods, and I fear what humanity will do with it. The fictional narrative ends here, but history tells us what came next. The nuclear arms race, the Cold War, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. The world would learn to live under the shadow of the mushroom cloud, always one mistake, one miscalculation away from catastrophe. The airmen who delivered the first atomic bombs would grow old, some proud of their service, others haunted by it, all marked by their participation in the moment when warfare changed forever. The letter that our fictional Mitchell wrote but never sent represents all the unspoken fears, doubts, and moral anguish of those who participate in war. Every generation of warriors faces similar dilemmas, though perhaps none as stark as those faced by the men who delivered atomic weapons. They were asked to be both soldiers and executioners on a scale previously unimaginable. They did their duty, but that duty extracted a price that some of them paid for the rest of their lives. The story of those who delivered the first atomic bombs is ultimately a story about all of us, about how we handle power, how we make moral choices in impossible situations, and how we live with the consequences of our actions. As this narrative draws to a close, we return to the image of Mitchell, standing on the tarmac at Tinian, the letter still in his pocket, trying to make sense of what he's just been part of. He knows that he's participated in history, that his name will be forever linked with this moment. But he also knows that he's just a man, an ordinary person who was asked to do an extraordinary and terrible thing. His struggle to reconcile these two realities is the struggle we all face in a nuclear age. How to be human in a world where humanity has the power to destroy itself. The letter remains unsent, a private testimony to the cost of being an instrument of history. But its message resonates across the decades. Remember us not just for what we did, but for who we were. Remember that even in the midst of total war, even when dropping atomic bombs, we remained human beings capable of doubt, fear, love, and hope. Remember us alive, not just as the deliverers of death, but as people who struggled with the moral weight of our actions. This is the legacy of those who flew the atomic missions, not just the successful completion of their military objective, but the demonstration that even in extremis, even when wielding the power of the sun itself, human conscience persists. That persistence of conscience, that refusal to become mere automatons of destruction, may be our best hope for surviving the atomic age they ushered in. The sun sets over Tinian, and as it has for millennia, indifferent to human struggles and achievements. But for those who were there in August 1945, for those who participated in the atomic missions, the sunset would never look quite the same. They had seen an artificial sun, created by human hands, rise over Japan. They had felt its heat from miles away. They had watched its light burn shadows into concrete and turn sand to glass. And they knew that this new sun, this atomic fire, would cast its shadow over all future generations. The story ends where it began, with a man trying to write a letter to explain the unexplainable. But perhaps the very attempt to explain, to maintain human connection and moral reflection even in the face of atomic warfare, is itself the message. As long as we continue to struggle with the implications of what happened in August 1945, as long as we refuse to become comfortable with weapons of mass destruction, as long as we remember the human beings on both sides of the bomb, those who delivered it and those who suffered from it, we maintain our humanity in an inhuman age. The letter, whether sent or unsent, whether real or fictional, stands as a testament to the endurance of human conscience, even in the darkest moments of history. It reminds us that behind every great historical event are individual human beings, with all their fears, hopes, doubts, and dreams. And it challenges us to consider what we would do, how we would act, what letters we would write, if we found ourselves at a similar crossroads of history. The atomic age began with a flash of light over Hiroshima. It continues today, with thousands of nuclear weapons poised around the world, ready to be delivered at a moment's notice. The technology has become more sophisticated, the weapons more powerful, the delivery systems more reliable. But the fundamental questions raised by those first atomic missions remain unchanged. What are the limits of military necessity? How do we balance duty to country with duty to humanity? What is the moral cost of wielding ultimate power? These questions have no easy answers, which is why the story of the atomic missions continues to resonate. Each generation must grapple with them anew, must decide for itself how to live in a world where the means of total destruction exist. The fictional Mitchell's letter, with its mixture of duty and doubt, pride and shame, love and fear, captures the essential paradox of the atomic age. That our greatest power is also our greatest danger. That the same species capable of splitting the atom is also capable of love, compassion, and moral reflection. As we move forward into an uncertain future, with new technologies threatening to make nuclear weapons seem quaint by comparison, the lessons of August 1945 become more, not less, relevant. The need for moral reflection, for maintaining human conscience even in the midst of technological revolution, for remembering that there are real human beings on all sides of every conflict, remains paramount. The letter from our fictional airman reminds us of these truths, calls us to remember not just the events of history but the human beings who lived them. This work of historical fiction has attempted to explore the human dimensions of one of history's most significant events. While the character of James Mitchell and his letter are entirely fictional, the historical context, the preparations on Tinian, the mission itself, the destruction of Hiroshima, are based on historical records. The real airmen who flew these missions have their own stories, their own experiences, their own moral reckonings with what they did. This fictional narrative is not meant to speak for them, but rather to explore the universal human themes that their experiences embody. In creating this narrative, great care has been taken to respect both the victims of the atomic bombings and the airmen who carried them out. Both groups were caught up in the vast machinery of war, asked to pay prices that no human beings should have to pay. Their stories, both real and imagined, remind us of the cost of war and the importance of working toward a world where such terrible choices need never be made again. James Mitchell, our fictional airman, did return home. He married Martha in a small ceremony in October 1945, just 2 months after Japan's surrender. The wedding photos show a young couple smiling, she in a simple white dress, he in his dress uniform with its new decorations. But those who knew him well could see something different in his eyes, a distance that hadn't been there before the war. They bought that house with the west-facing porch, just as they had planned. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Mitchell found work at a local airline company training civilian pilots. He was good at it, patient and thorough, though he never spoke about his military service. When his children asked what he did in the war, he would simply say, "I flew planes," and change the subject. The letter he had written that night on Tinny and remained in a drawer in his desk, unsent, unread by anyone else. Sometimes, late at night, he would take it out and read it, remembering who he had been before that morning over Hiroshima, remembering the weight of what he had carried in the belly of his aircraft. He thought about destroying it many times, but something always stopped him. It was evidence, he thought, though of what exactly he could never quite articulate. In the 1950s, as the Cold War intensified and both the United States and Soviet Union built arsenals of hydrogen bombs that made Little Boy look like a firecracker, Mitchell would watch the news with growing unease. The world had not learned the lesson he had hoped it would. Instead of making war obsolete, Atomic weapons had simply raised the stakes. Now, instead of cities, entire nations could be erased. Instead of thousands dead, it would be millions, perhaps billions. He began to have nightmares. Not every night, but often enough. In them, he would be back in the Enola Gay watching the bomb fall, counting down those 43 seconds. But in the dreams, the bomb never exploded. It just kept falling, and he kept counting. And below him the city went about its morning routine, oblivious to what was descending upon it. He would wake up still counting, covered in sweat, his heart racing. Martha knew, of course. Wives always know. She would hold him, not asking questions, not demanding explanations. She had read the newspapers, seen the photographs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. She could do the math. Her husband had been in the 509th. He had flown B-29s. He had been there. The details didn't matter. The weight he carried was evident in his occasional 1,000-yard stares, in the way he flinched at unexpected loud noises, in the way he could never watch fireworks on the 4th of July. In 1955, on the 10th anniversary of Hiroshima, a reporter somehow tracked Mitchell down. Word had gotten out that he had been part of the atomic missions, though his exact role remained unclear. The reporter, a young man fresh from journalism school, showed up at his door with a notebook and an eager expression. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, "I'd like to talk to you about your experiences in the war, about what it was like to be part of history." Mitchell looked at the young man for a long moment, then quietly closed the door. The reporter persisted, coming back several times, even attempting to interview Martha and the children. Finally, Mitchell agreed to meet him, but only to say this: history is what happens to other people. When you're living it, it's just life and you do what you have to do. I have nothing to say about Hiroshima that hasn't been said by others. Please leave my family alone. The reporter wrote a small piece about the reluctant veteran who wouldn't talk, painting Mitchell as a mysterious figure haunted by his participation in world-changing events. It ran in the local paper and was quickly forgotten. But it had an effect on Mitchell. He realized that as the years passed, as the atomic bombings became history rather than memory, there would be more reporters, more questions, more attempts to make sense of what had happened. In 1960, he made a decision. He would write down his experiences not for publication, but for his children and grandchildren. He wanted them to understand, when the time was right, what their father and grandfather had been part of. He wanted them to know not the sanitized version that was already beginning to appear in history textbooks, but the human truth of it, the fear, the doubt, the terrible weight of following orders that you know will result in mass death. He wrote slowly, a few pages at a time, working in the evenings after the family had gone to bed. He described the preparation, the mission, the return. But more than that, he tried to capture what it had felt like to be an ordinary person caught up in extraordinary events. He wrote about his fellow crew members, most of whom he had lost touch with, scattered across America, each dealing with their memories in their own way. He wrote about the scientists he had met, brilliant men who seemed both proud and horrified by what they had created. He wrote about Colonel Tibbets, who publicly maintained that he had no regrets but who, Mitchell had heard, also had his share of sleepless nights. The writing was painful. Each session brought back memories he had tried to suppress. But it was also cathartic. Putting it down on paper, organizing the chaos of memory into narrative, gave him a measure of control over experiences that had threatened to overwhelm him. The manuscript grew to over 100 pages, a detailed account of one man's journey through the birth of the atomic age. He never finished it. In 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated, and the world seemed to spin into chaos. The Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the brink of nuclear war just a year earlier. The careful balance of terror that kept the peace seemed more fragile than ever. Mitchell put the manuscript in the same drawer as the unsent letter and never took it out again. His children grew up in the shadow of the atomic age without knowing their father's direct connection to its beginning. They practiced duck-and-cover drills in school, hiding under their desks as if that could protect them from a hydrogen bomb. They watched as the nuclear arms race accelerated, as both superpowers built enough weapons to destroy the world several times over. They protested the Vietnam War, questioned authority, demanded a different world than the one their parents had created. Mitchell watched his children's generation with a mixture of pride and concern. They were right to question, right to protest, right to demand better. But he also knew that the world was more complex than slogans and demonstrations could capture. He had been young once too, certain of right and wrong, before that morning over Hiroshima had taught him that sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones. In 1970, his eldest son, James Jr., came home from college for Thanksgiving. He had grown his hair long, wore bell-bottom jeans and a peace symbol around his neck. After dinner, fueled by wine and youthful righteousness, he launched into a speech about American imperialism, about the military-industrial complex, about the crimes committed in the name of democracy. When he brought up Hiroshima and Nagasaki, calling them war crimes, unnecessary slaughter, Mitchell quietly left the table. Martha found him on the porch, staring at the western sky where the sun was setting. "He doesn't know," she said softly. "No," Mitchell replied, "and maybe that's for the best." But that night, he took out the letter again, the one he had written 25 years earlier. He read it, remembering the young man he had been, full of doubt and fear but also duty and purpose. He thought about showing it to his son, about revealing his role in the events the boy was so quick to condemn. But what would that accomplish? Would it change his son's mind? Would it simply transfer the burden from father to son? In the end, he put the letter back in the drawer. The 1970s brought a strange kind of normalcy to the nuclear age. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction had created a perverse stability. The weapons were there, thousands upon thousands of them, but they had become abstract, theoretical. People went about their lives as if the sword of Damocles wasn't hanging over their heads. Mitchell found this both reassuring and troubling. Had humanity simply accepted the possibility of its own annihilation as the price of doing business? In 1975, on the 30th anniversary of Hiroshima, Mitchell received an unexpected letter. It was from one of his crew members, Tommy, the bombardier from Detroit who had carried his girl's picture everywhere. Tommy had indeed married that girl, had raised a family, had lived what appeared to be a normal life. But his letter revealed struggles similar to Mitchell's own. The nightmares, the guilt, the burden of being part of history. "Do you ever wonder," Tommy wrote, "what the world would be like if we hadn't dropped those bombs? Would the war have dragged on? Would millions have died invading Japan? Or would Japan have surrendered anyway? I go around and around with it. The historians say we saved lives. But Jim, I can't forget those photographs, those shadows burned into the concrete. We did that. We turned human beings into shadows." Mitchell wrote back, the first time he had communicated with any of his fellow crew members since the war. They began a correspondence that would last the rest of their lives. Two old soldiers trying to make sense of what they had done, finding comfort in shared experience and mutual understanding. Through Tommy, Mitchell learned about others from their unit. Some had thrived, burying their memories deep and moving on. Others had struggled with alcoholism, depression, broken marriages. One had committed suicide in 1950, leaving a note that said only, "I can't forget." In 1980, Mitchell retired from the airline. His children were grown, starting families of their own. He and Martha were grandparents now, watching a new generation grow up in a world that seemed both safer and more dangerous than the one they had known. The nuclear arsenals continued to grow, but no one had used them since Nagasaki. Perhaps deterrence worked. Perhaps humanity had learned just enough wisdom to step back from the brink. But Mitchell knew better than to trust in human wisdom. He had seen what fear and patriotism and orders could make good men do. He had been one of those men. The only thing preventing nuclear war, he believed, was luck and the grace of God, and he wasn't sure how much of either the world had left. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary, a television crew came to town, producing a documentary about the atomic bombings. They had somehow discovered Mitchell's role, despite his years of silence. They wanted to interview him to get his perspective for their program. Mitchell declined, but they persisted, even filming outside his house, interviewing neighbors who knew nothing about his war record. Finally, to get them to leave his family alone, Mitchell agreed to give a brief statement. He stood on his porch, looking directly into the camera, and said, "I was a soldier. I followed orders. Those orders resulted in the deaths of many thousands of people. I have lived with that fact for 40 years. I will live with it until I die. That is all I have to say." The documentary used just a few seconds of his statement, but it was enough. Letters began arriving, some thanking him for his service, others condemning him as a war criminal. Mitchell read them all but answered none. What was there to say? How could he explain to strangers what he couldn't fully explain to himself? Martha died in 1988, quietly, in her sleep. They had been married for 43 years, the same number of seconds it had taken for the bomb to fall from the Enola Gay to its detonation point over Hiroshima. Mitchell noticed this coincidence and found it both meaningless and somehow significant. Time was strange that way, expanding and contracting, making some moments last forever while decades passed in a blur. After Martha's death, Mitchell's children worried about him living alone. But he insisted he was fine, and in many ways he was. The solitude suited him. He could think, remember, without worrying about burdening anyone else with his thoughts. He continued his correspondence with Tommy, the letters becoming longer and more philosophical as both men approached their final years. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The Cold War, that long standoff that had defined the post-atomic world, was ending. Mitchell watched on television as young Germans took sledgehammers to the concrete barrier, their faces full of joy and hope. He wanted to share their optimism, but he knew that while the political conflict might be ending, the nuclear weapons remained. The knowledge of how to build them could never be unlearned. The atomic age would continue, regardless of who was in power in Washington or Moscow. In 1990, Mitchell's health began to fail. His heart, which had raced through those 43 seconds over Hiroshima, was wearing out. His doctor recommended surgery, but Mitchell declined. He was 70 years old. He had lived longer than many of the people who had been in Hiroshima that day. It seemed almost obscene to fight for more time when he had taken so much time from others. He spent his remaining months putting his affairs in order. He destroyed most of his writings about the war, keeping only the original letter from Tinian and a few pages of his unfinished manuscript. These he placed in an envelope addressed to his children, with instructions that it not be opened until after his death. He wanted them to know, finally, but he couldn't bear to tell them himself, to see their faces change as they realized what their father had done. Tommy came to visit in the spring of 1991. Two old men sat on the porch, watching the sun set, not saying much. What was there to say that hadn't been said in dozens of letters? They had shared something that no one else could understand, a burden that had shaped the rest of their lives. That was enough. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Tommy asked finally. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. "I think we did what we were asked to do. Whether it was right or wrong, necessary or unnecessary, I don't know. I've spent 45 years trying to figure that out, and I'm no closer to an answer than I was that morning over Hiroshima. The historians say," Tommy began. "The historians weren't there," Mitchell interrupted gently. "They can analyze, justify, condemn, but they weren't there. They didn't see the flash. They didn't feel the shock wave. They didn't watch the cloud rise. We did, and we have to live with that or die with it." Tommy left the next morning. They both knew it would be the last time they saw each other. They shook hands, two old soldiers who had once been young men asked to do the unthinkable. No words were necessary. Mitchell died on August 6, 1991, 46 years to the day after Hiroshima. His children found him on the porch in his chair, facing west. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that might have reminded him of something else, long ago and far away. At the funeral, his children were surprised by the attendance. Men they had never met, some in military uniforms, came to pay their respects. One introduced himself as a historian who had been studying the 509th Composite Group. Another was the son of a crew member from another plane in the atomic missions. They spoke of Mitchell with respect, calling him a good soldier, a man who had done his duty in difficult times. It was only after the funeral that Mitchell's children opened the envelope he had left for them. Inside was the letter from Tinian, yellow with age, the ink faded but still readable. There were also a few pages from his unfinished manuscript, describing not the mission itself but the weight of living with it afterward. And there was a final note, written just days before his death. My dear children, I leave you this not as a burden but as a trust. I was part of something terrible and necessary, or perhaps just terrible. History will judge as it always does, but history wasn't there. I pulled the lever that opened the bomb bay doors. I counted down those 43 seconds. I watched the cloud rise over Hiroshima. I have carried that with me every day since. Now I pass it to you, not the guilt that dies with me, but the knowledge. We live in a world where such things are possible. We have made them possible. The question for your generation and your children's generation is what to do with that possibility. I don't have answers, only questions and regrets and a hope that somehow, someday, humanity will find a way to step back from the brink we approached that day. Remember that behind every weapon, every policy, every decision about war and peace, there are human beings who will have to live with the consequences. Remember that even good people can do terrible things when history demands it. And remember me not as a hero or a villain, but as a man who tried to do his duty and spent the rest of his life wondering if he should have refused. All my love, Dad. The letter from Tinian, the manuscript pages, and the final note were donated to a military museum, where they became part of an exhibit on the human cost of war. Thousands of visitors read Mitchell's words, his doubts and fears from that night before the atomic age began. Some were moved to tears. Others were angry that he seemed to be making excuses. But all were forced to confront the reality that the atomic bombings were not just historical events but human experiences, lived by real people who had to make impossible choices. Years later, Mitchell's grandson, studying history in college, wrote a thesis on the psychological impact of the atomic bombings on the air crews involved. He interviewed surviving members of the 509th, read letters and diaries, analyzed the statistics on alcoholism, divorce, and suicide among the atomic veterans. His conclusion was that these men had been asked to carry a burden too great for any individual, that they had been sacrificed to history as surely as the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The professor who graded the thesis wrote in the margins, "You seem to have a personal connection to this topic." The grandson wrote back, "My grandfather was there. He never spoke of it, but he left us his words. They haunt me as the experience haunted him." And perhaps that is the true legacy of those who delivered the atomic bombs. Not just the mushroom clouds and the destroyed cities, but the haunting passed down through generations, a reminder of what humanity is capable of and a warning about the price of such capability. The letter from Tinian, whether real or imagined, speaks to this haunting, this burden that extends beyond those who were there to all of us who live in the world they created. Today, as nuclear weapons proliferate, as new nations acquire the capability to split the atom, as the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki pass away and their testimony becomes history rather than memory, the questions raised by Mitchell and his fellow airmen remain urgent. How do we live with the power to destroy ourselves? How do we ensure that such weapons are never used again? How do we remember the human cost of war in an age of technological abstraction? The answers are not clear, may never be clear. But the questions themselves, the moral struggle they represent, the refusal to become comfortable with instruments of mass destruction, these are perhaps our best hope. As long as we continue to be haunted by Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as long as we remember the James Mitchells who delivered the bombs and lived with the consequences, as long as we refuse to forget or forgive ourselves too easily, we maintain the moral tension necessary to prevent nuclear weapons from being used again. The story ends where it began, with a letter that tries to capture the uncapturable, to explain the unexplainable. But perhaps the attempt itself is what matters. In reaching for words to describe their experience, the atomic veterans, real and fictional, remind us that behind every strategic decision, every military action, every moment of history, there are human beings with consciences, fears, loves, and doubts. Their humanity, preserved in letters and memories and stories passed down through generations, stands as a counterweight to the cold logic of nuclear strategy. James Mitchell's fictional letter from Tinian, his 46 years of living with what he had done, his final message to his children. These form a narrative of individual responsibility in an age of mass destruction. They remind us that even when we feel we have no choice, we are still choosing. Even when we follow orders, we remain morally accountable. Even when history sweeps us along, we retain our humanity and our capacity for reflection and regret. The letter from Tinian, whether real or imagined, is part of the struggle, a voice from the past warning the future, a reminder that we are all, in our own ways, counting down those 43 seconds, hoping that when we reach zero, we will have found a way to choose life over death, creation over destruction, peace over war. The final image is of the letter itself, aged and yellowed, preserved behind glass in a museum. Visitors pause to read it, some taking pictures, others standing in silent contemplation. Children ask their parents what it means. Parents struggle to explain. And in that struggle, in that attempt to make sense of the senseless, to find meaning in mass destruction, the real work of the atomic age continues, the work of remembering, of learning, of trying to ensure that never again will human beings be asked to carry such a burden, to deliver such destruction, to live with such consequences. The letter ends as it began. Remember me alive, not as the deliverer of death, but as a human being who struggled with an impossible moral burden. In that memory, in that recognition of shared humanity even in the midst of war's dehumanizing machinery, lies whatever hope we have for a future free from the shadow of the mushroom cloud.